Well, Bob, I talk about facing that moment in time where we don't know how we're going to overcome something in my book, Shine On. And I talk about that moment in time as being the space in between, that moment in trial when you don't know how you're going to overcome something.
Yeah.
And in that moment, I ask the question we always ask when we don't know how things are going to be, how the future is going, what the future is going to hold, whether it's facing a life challenge or a health challenge. And I said, why me? Why me? And I cried out to God over and over again, God, how could you let this happen to me? And my children came to visit me, and the impact of seeing that my son had no idea who I was because he was a baby and he had already attached to a nanny, and my daughter was afraid of my arms, that impact took me to the deepest sorrow I'd ever experienced. And I cried out to God again. And God stepped in and just answered so many questions in my heart. Questions like, what am I going to do? My son doesn't know who I am. And how will I know he knows who I am? And I talk about those answers in the book. But what he really did was make himself present to me when he sent in a nurse to read the very first piece of scripture that reached out and touched my heart. And it was Psalm 139. You knit me together in my mother's womb, and I am fearfully and wonderfully made. See, I was at the end of myself and in the darkest point of my life. And in comes this piece of scripture that tells me that God created me with purpose and love. And I had this image of me being woven together in my mother's womb before time as I knew it. And the depth of the love that God had for me. And I knew that he was crying with me, that he had not caused this, but in our times of pain and suffering, he cries with us, just as Psalm 56 would eventually tell me.
All right, I want to isolate this. I think this is critically important here. We may have listeners at this point that are experiencing what you call a space in between. I love that description. It says a whole lot. In your situation, you were in this period of time where you were coming to terms with what had happened to you with respect to your loss, that you had lost your limbs, and really, and I guess one of the components of that space in between is like, well, what do I do next? How do I deal with this? How do I process this? How do I even move forward? And I would imagine that people get in that situation and they want to give up because it's so overwhelming. We may have people that are listening today, I would imagine we do, who perhaps they've received a medical diagnosis of cancer, for instance, for themselves or for a loved one. Maybe they've had a loved one that has been in an accident. Maybe there's a relationship that has broken apart, and people are living in that space in between and not exactly sure what to do next. What words of encouragement do you give in the book Shine On, and would you share with people today about navigating that space in between?
Well, Bob, that was not the first space in between that I sat in. I had sat in many more through my life, but I'd never reached out to Jesus truly until that moment. And what I would say to you is, oh, I know you're sitting there and you don't know what the future holds, and your heart is breaking, and it probably is sitting on the floor in a million pieces. But it's only Jesus who can pick it up and put it back together again for you, like he did for me. It's only Jesus that sits in the space between and waits for you to reach out and let him in. He said, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. The only kind of rest that we need in that moment is the one that comes from him. So whether you know him or you don't know him, I encourage you to just reach out to him and say, Jesus, this is yours. I need you to carry me through this because I don't know how to get through it myself.